Ni hao, comrades. So in this video, as part of my Chinese philosophy series, we're going to shift from the ancient Chinese philosophy that I've been primarily talking about to talk about one of the most important modern Chinese philosophers. We're going to be talking about Quotations from Chairman Mao Tse Tung, also called Mao's Red Book. This is the sort of fundamental guide to communist Chinese philosophy under Mao. After Mao's death, things sort of shift, and the Chinese Communist government, the People's Republic of China, shifts away from communism, debatably into what's sometimes called neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about Mao. So first off, Mao is a communist. He's in the Marxist tradition. And it's very clear that he's in the Marxist tradition. We have some elements here of traditional Marxist orthodoxy. For instance, in describing communism. The other thing before I switch to some of the things Mao says, the Red Book is sort of like, say, the Analects of Confucius. This isn't a single thought-out, coherent philosophical text. This is a collection of sayings, mostly from the late 30s, 40s, and 50s. Some as early as the late 20s, and some as late as the 60s. But these are excerpts from speeches, excerpts from written texts, various places that Mao has laid out different principles in different categories. So there's a section, for instance, on the Communist Party, on classes and class struggle, on socialism and communism, the mass line, political work, patriotism and internationalism, correcting mistaken ideas, self-criticism and self-criticism, etc., etc. So we've got a lot of different bits and pieces here from a couple of decades of Mao's various thought. So he describes, so again, one of the things, we've got a strain of Marxist orthodoxy here. So Mao describes communists, or a communist. He says, a communist should have largeness of mind, and he should be staunch and active, looking upon the interests of the revolution as his very life, and subordinating his personal interests to those of the revolution. Always and everywhere he should adhere to principle and wage a tireless struggle against all incorrect ideas and actions, so as to consolidate the collective life of the party and strengthen the ties between the party and the masses. He should be more concerned about the party and the masses than about any individual, and more concerned about others than about himself. Only thus can he be considered a communist. So the other sort of big element that's really clear, or one of the other big elements that's really clearly orthodox Marxism, is that Mao believes that the fundamental structure of society is class struggle. So he says, classes struggle. Some classes triumph, others are eliminated. Such is history. Such is the history of civilization for thousands of years. To interpret history from this viewpoint is historical materialism. Standing in opposition to this viewpoint is historical idealism. So we'll talk more in just a little bit about the idea of historical materialism, because that's really important with Mao's philosophy. But he also says, changes in society are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in society. That is, the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the contradiction between classes, and the contradiction between the old and the new. It is the development of these contradictions that pushes society forward and gives the impetus for the suppression of the old society by the new. So again, this is the basis of historical materialism. Thinking about the change of history not as a sort of natural evolution based on ideas or based on inventions or innovations, but thinking about the movement of society, the progress of society, as being about conflict, tensions, wherein the internal contradictions of a particular social mode, for Marx, these are called slavery, these are called feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and communism, wherein the contradictions within a society itself, its attempts to order the world, order the means of production, order ideas in such a way, works for a time because it resolves the contradictions of the previous period. So feudalism functions for several centuries because it resolves the internal conflicts of slave societies. Greco-Roman, classical antiquity, ancient Egypt, Persia, Babylon, etc., etc. So feudalism works for a while. But then feudalism, at some point, can no longer contain its internal contradictions. It can no longer contain the problems within that social system. And so capitalism arises to replace that system by solving those problems. However, capitalism then brings its own set of problems, which eventually will be resolved, according to Marx, by the socialist and communist revolutions. So one of the things that becomes slightly less orthodox, and this is where we get slightly into a question of terminology, because there's orthodox Marxism, and then there's Marxism-Leninism. And as we all know, Lenin famously said, "I am the walrus."
It's like Lenin said, you look for the person who will benefit, and
I am the walrus.
You'll you know what I'm trying to say.
I am the walrus.
That fucking bitch.
Oh yeah.
I am the walrus.
Shut the fuck up, Donnie. V.I. Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
What the fuck is he talking about?
So, Maoism is, in my reading, a sort of third term, a third sort of evolution in the sort of dialectic of Marxism, if you will. And Leftist YouTube, you are more than welcome to come into my comments section and explain how much more complicated this is than what I'm about to say. This is a very, very basic sort of gloss of Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, and Maoism. But essentially, so Marx says the revolution is going to happen in an industrial society. So England, Germany, France, maybe the United States, these are Marx's top contenders when he's writing in the mid to late 1800s. Then your boy Lenin comes along in Russia, and he's like, well, Russia is not an industrial nation, so in principle, this shouldn't be the place the revolution happens. But two big innovations in what comes to be called Marxism-Leninism. One is the idea of the vanguard of the proletariat. So this is a small group of thinkers, of ideologues, of students, whatever it is, who lead the revolution without necessarily having sort of widespread class consciousness and unity among the workers and the peasants. So they lead the revolution, and then we have industrialization under socialism. So we saw this in the USSR, starting in the 1920s. We had massive sort of drives for creating industry in a very rural country. And they did that under the auspices of socialism or communism. So we have some of those elements here in Mao. For instance, the very first thing in Mao's Red Book says, "The force at the core leading our cause forward is the Chinese Communist Party. The theoretical basis guiding our thinking is Marxism-Leninism." And then number 2, "If there is to be a revolution, there must be a revolutionary party. Without a revolutionary party, without a party built on the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary theory and in the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary style, it is impossible to lead the working class and the broad masses of the people in defeating imperialism and its running dogs." So Mao is very clearly locating himself and his philosophy within a Marxist-Leninist tradition. However, China in the 30s, 40s, into the 50s was even more rural than Russia had been under the Tsars and under the early years of the Soviet Union. Partially, China is less industrial because China had endured what was called the Century of Humiliation, which was basically where Western powers didn't officially colonize China, but they developed what were called spheres of influence, which basically were areas where European powers were allowed to trade. They were allowed basically to sell their goods, and then they bought agricultural products and things like this from the Chinese. And so they did prevent China from industrializing because they didn't want to compete. The European, British, French, German, whatever it was, industrial nations didn't want to compete with local industry. So they forcibly kept China agricultural. The other component is that in the 30s into the 40s, but to the end of World War II, large portions of China are occupied by the Japanese army, and the Japanese army destroys a massive amount of what little infrastructure China has. So, Mao takes Marxism-Leninism, and again, we've got those elements of orthodox Marxism, but he takes Lenin's idea that you can have a vanguard of the proletariat, and then once the revolution has occurred, you can industrialize from there. And Mao kind of says, you don't actually need to do that. We don't necessarily need a centralized industrial infrastructure. We can run a revolution on the strength of the peasants. And so the peasants are a key recurring idea in Mao's philosophy. For instance, he says, the ruthless economic exploitation and political oppression of the peasants by the landlord class forced them into numerous uprisings against its rule. It was the class struggle of the peasants, the peasant uprisings and peasant wars that constituted the real motive force of historical development in Chinese feudal society. So Mao is locating revolutionary energy not with an industrial working proletariat the way that Marx does, but with peasants, with agricultural laborers. And this becomes central to Mao's ideas. He says, we are now carrying out a revolution not only in the social system, the change from private to public ownership, but also in technology, the change from handicraft to large-scale modern machine production, and the two revolutions are interconnected. In agriculture, with conditions as they are in our country, cooperation must precede the use of big machinery. In capitalist countries, agriculture develops in a capitalist way. Therefore, we must on no account regard industry and agriculture, socialist industrialization, and the socialist transformation of agriculture as two separate and isolated things, and on no account must we emphasize the one and play down the other. This is in contrast to much of what Marx says, as well as what Lenin and the Marxist-Leninists in the USSR say, which is much more oriented toward industry than to agriculture. Agriculture often in Marxist theory sort of plays a following role to industry. Mao also says we must have faith first that the peasant masses are ready to advance step by step along the road of socialism under the leadership of the party, and second, that the party is capable of leading the peasants along this road. These 2 points are the essence of the matter, the main current. So again, this is where he branches off from Marxism-Leninism. And basically, Mao takes the position that the peasants can be the primary revolutionary class, which is totally absent from Marx. Like, Marx would never accept that idea. But Mao is responding to the particular conditions inherent in China at the time, and he's saying what we can do is industrialize the peasantry. We don't need to build, we don't need to do what the Soviet Union did, where we build massive factories and forcibly move millions of peasants to cities, to industrial centers. Instead, we can create industrial production from where the peasants currently are. And he ends up doing this in what's called the Great Leap Forward, which is not a success, to say the least. So the kind of things that were involved in the Great Leap Forward was, again, this industrialization of the peasantry. So, for instance, that involved things like forcing peasants to smelt iron in homemade forges. So, you were a rice farmer, or whatever it was, a wheat farmer, or whatever it was, and now you're tasked with producing X amount of iron for industrial production. This doesn't really work that well. So one of the reasons is that producing iron in small home forges produces an inferior quality of iron. It's very, very difficult to produce iron effectively, and it's very difficult to produce high-quality iron. And so a lot of the iron that's produced in these home forges is very low quality, very unreliable, etc., etc. A second problem is, because you're now demanding that peasants devote their time to what should be done through factories, through industrial infrastructure, that's taking time away from the work they need to do for agricultural production. And that is kind of one of the factors that contributes to some of the famines that strike China in the 50s and the 60s. So it doesn't really work. It undermines both agricultural production and it undermines agricultural production, and it fails to build industrial infrastructure. So it's a huge failure. But again, it's based in Mao's sort of belief that the peasants can be the vanguard of a revolutionary society. The other thing that it is built on is this idea of frugality. China was a very poor country in the 40s and 50s when Mao rises to power. So he says, we must see to it that all our cadres and all our people constantly bear in mind that ours is a big socialist country, but an economically backward and poor one, and that this is a very great contradiction. To make China rich and strong needs several decades of intense effort, which will include, among other things, the effort to practice strict economy and combat waste, i.e. the policy of building up our country through diligence and frugality. He then says, diligence and frugality should be practiced in running factories and shops and all state-owned cooperative and other enterprises. The principle of diligence and frugality should be observed in everything. This principle of economy is one of the basic principles of socialist economics. China is a big country, but she's still very poor. It will take several decades to make China prosperous. Even then, we will still have to observe the principle of diligence and frugality, but it is in the coming few decades, during the present series of 5-year plans, that we must particularly advocate diligence and frugality, and we must pay special attention to economy. So we get out of these statements two important things. One is the idea of economy, of being frugal. This is one of the bases for the rejection of mass industrialization, because that's incredibly expensive, and Mao believed that you could achieve the same result more cheaply and effectively by decentralizing industrial production amongst the peasantry. The second thing that we get is an acknowledgement that it's going to take decades to build China's economic power and industrial strength. And interestingly enough, several decades after the Chinese Revolution, after Mao comes to power in 1949, China's economy really develops. It really takes off. It's hard to say whether or not that's because of Mao and the programs that he implemented, but today China is probably the number 2 economy in the world, I believe. So who knows? Maybe for as much suffering as it cost, as many lives as it cost, maybe Mao was ultimately right. Maybe Mao was ultimately sort of beneficial for China in some sense.